The next talk comes from Jon Murden, who's the director at the Dorset County Museum. And again, I think this might feel like a familiar topic to some people. His talk's called Clearing the Governance Logjam, and it's about looking at organisations that have deeply ingrained historic governance structures in place and looking at how you can begin to change them. And here it says, is conflict inevitable? I think we're about to find out. So, thanks, Jon.
Just going to see if I can move that. Aha. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you this afternoon. I think I'm trying to pick up on a few themes that we spoke about this morning, but I think this is, as you described, my job as director of the Dorset County Museum. My job title is actually Executive Director of the Dorset Natural History and Archaeological Society. And that, in its sense, gives some of the tangle we as an organisation had got ourselves in. The Society owns and manages the County Museum in Dorchester, but we're an independent museum, we're not part of the local authority, and we never have been. We can trace our history actually back to 1845, when the railway arrived in Dorset and threatened to destroy a Roman hill fort and a Neolithic henge monument. So we actually began life as an environmental pressure group. We succeeded at that point in persuading Brunel to change the layout of the railway in Dorset, which is why, as one of the smaller county towns, Dorchester's got 2 railway stations rather than 1. That's our fault. And after that had happened, the people who'd founded that pressure group resolved to collect the objects that had been revealed by development, and they established a museum to display them in. And the earliest collecting policy was all around things that were found on, under or above the ground of Dorset. So it's actually quite a nice, tight collecting policy given the time. By the 1880s, I will get on a bit, don't worry, in a minute. By the 1880s, the museum's main user was actually a group of people called the Dorset Antiquarian Field Club. They held their lectures and meetings and so on there. And that continued until about 1928, when the museum went bust. And the Field Club took it over. And that became the origin of the governance model that we still basically have at the museum. It's been updated periodically to meet changing company and charity legislation, but our roots are essentially a Victorian gentleman's club. That's what we were, and that's what a lot of our members would like us still to be, actually. Essentially, we are like an old-fashioned mutual building society in theory. We don't have friends. You can become a member of the society. And that then entitles you to be part of the constituency that nominates and elects the Board of Trustees, to which I, as the director, report. So in theory, it's a very inclusive, democratic model. In reality, it led to a rather self-perpetuating domination by a clique who had a very clear set of ideas that were rooted in being a Victorian learned society. It became quite exclusive, it became very elitist, and because you could only vote in person at the meetings, and only 80 or so people ever turned up, it became very inward-looking. It was made worse by certain elements, creating an artificial division, as they saw it, between the interests of the society and the museum. Whereas historically this had been 2 sides of the same coin, there was an ongoing desire to prioritise the interest of the society over that of the museum. I've never quite understood how that came about, but it started in 1992, and that was the year before I did my GCSEs, so I don't hold myself responsible for that. So it had been going on quite a long time before I turned up in 2010. The 20 years of arguing and infighting really had led the museum and the society absolutely nowhere apart from the edge of a financial abyss. So by 2010, the loss that year was £120,000 on a turnover of £400,000, and over the previous decade, the best part of £1 million worth of reserves had been frittered away. The visitor numbers had collapsed down to about 12,000 a year. They were dated, unappealing displays, there were crumbling buildings, and there was a policy and procedural vacuum. So I sat in my garden in this lovely Dorset cottage, having left a really nice job in Liverpool, going, what have I done? So the crisis in that sense, as we heard from Caroline this morning, was helpful because it was an undeniable catalyst for change, and there were also a number of rays of light to hang on to. The first one was that my chairman at that point, by hook or by crook, had managed to get onto the board and get to be the chair. I think that's largely because of her experience as an activist within Dorset Tory party politics. That turned to be quite helpful, actually, at that, knowing how to stab people in the back from time to time. But she was determined to modernise, and I was recruited because she thought I'd be the person to do that. We had an amazing collection. We still do have an amazing collection. And also, it was very helpful, the local authority had largely had enough of this mess by this time. So we had things on our side. And I've got a massively overinflated idea of my own ability as well, so that helped too. So we set around the task, some of which was quite radical in that first instance, about dealing with the financial crisis. But then it was how to deal with some of this logjam on the board. And because we had members who were an electorate, the chairman and I and those trustees who knew the need for change decided to cut them out and go to mass meetings, communicating, getting feedback with the members, getting feedback directly from the volunteers, trying to find out what they viewed the problems as, what they thought the solutions would be, to engage them in the problem solving at a detailed level. Then that absolutely broke the idea that the clique were representing the voice of the membership, because we could prove they weren't, or at least demonstrate they weren't, because we'd got the voices, we'd spoken to them directly. We also began a big recruitment drive for members to try and diversify away from being a learned society with academic interests, to bring in families, to bring in younger people, to bring in our volunteers. In terms of advocacy for the volunteers, sometimes this was done by killing with kindness, away days and trips and coffee mornings. On other sides, it was less pleasant. It was a bit like in Machiavelli's The Prince, about the Medici. Is the prince to be loved or feared? It depended actually on who you were, I think, was the answer to that. It was clear that for certain trustees who were, by this point, clearly blocking progress and stifling what we were trying to do, that they needed to move on. So we used the old learned society rules to our advantage, because there was an old Victorian rule about being blackballed for ungentlemanly conduct. So my chairman lined that one up, provoked them one meeting, they had a rant, and then he got them. It was quite amazing. But the only court of appeal was our president, and they'd been lined up as well. I'm saying this all in the hope that Chatham House rules are applying, but there we go. The second strand was the strategic partnerships we wanted to bring about to bear fruit, and that was about changing attitudes on the board towards partnerships. They'd been seen for some reason that I still can't understand as a risk. If we went in partnership with somebody, it meant we were weak and couldn't cope. I can't even get to my head around where that piece of thinking comes from. But we decided to begin to look for partners to help us deliver what we wanted to be able to do in terms of public programmes. So we started to work with the British Museum, with the Natural History Museum, with the local universities. And this all began to bear fruit, really, and this was where the corner had turned. By 2012, we returned the first surplus in 15 years. The year after that, we'd gone up to 70,000 visitors. So then everything began to go. We felt like we'd turned the corner and broken that logjam, because that's when success began to work for us and that part of our board. There was a slight uprising, but then we found our members and our volunteers, because they were on our side, actually went with us on this one and shouted down the naysayers. It's not... The civil war is never over, I think. It keeps going on. I've been told I've got 30 seconds. So we keep going on, but trying to be positive. We've still got lots of challenges to try and move forward on in terms of our governance structure, the management of the election of trustees, which is still quite chaotic. It means we struggle to diversify our board. It means it still can very easily be unwound and unpicked, all this. But we're more focused on the skills we need on the board than ever before, and on delivering the successful museum that we need for our collection and for our community. And so I'm hoping that the board can continue its renewal and its reinvigoration and get the skills and diversity it needs long into the future. Thank you.